As we took in each site, both commonages and non-commonage areas, we had an ecologist come in and she completed a baseline survey to, basically what we asked her to do was to do the baseline survey, tell us what's actually out there, but also for her as an ecologist to tell us what's a wish list, what would she like in terms of that should be on these hills and what we need to do to get it. It was the first time there was proper surveys on any of those hills because we had very little data available. One of the issues with the uplands is there's a big disconnect between farmers and ecologists and environmentalists, and while the ecologists might have great ideas about what needs to be done and what can be done, the farmers will turn around and say, well, that's ridiculous, that's stupid because of whatever reasons from the farming side. So one of the big things we got out of the SUAS project was we brought our ecologists and our farmers together. We brought them out to walk on the hills.
Well, I didn't know where that was going to go all right now. This was all new to me now, you know. That was a bit of a new one, all right now, but...
And when we went up around the hill, and I'm after being up around there for a good many years, she was pointing out things to me that that we were walking over that I didn't even realise. She was pointing out to us where there was evidence of where there had been bits of landslips, all that type of thing, you know, up on the high part of the hill.
She was explaining to us how good the moss was and all that. But sheep don't eat moss, and that's so. Anyway, but sure, they have she has her ideas and we have our ideas. And
so I suppose I found it very interesting, all right, like, you know, what they were coming up with, like, you know, what they thought was bad, we thought was good, like, you know, or didn't see the difference, you know. They were into their mosses and little growths of plants and...
So yeah, we definitely learned something from it. So yeah, it was a positive experience. It was a dialogue as well. She was listening to us as well and getting our opinion and so on as well, yeah.
I know there's some farmers who would say, and say it, rightly say it, you know, after the visit with Faith going out to hills with him, Faith and Declan going out, it was the first time that anybody ever went up the hills with him and showed him what was there and what was wanted there, and you know, and how things could be changed, how things could be improved or kept as they were. It was the first time that there ever was anybody ever talked to him out on the hills.
She pointed out, she showed us that we've a very rare bog orchid down here, which is a real rare plant. It's not going to help us farm, but when we know it's there, you kind of respect the area a little bit more, you work around it. What I got from it was it's trying to improve the quality of the commonage and the quality of the hill, and then alongside that you'll find it better for your farm, for your stock. So
I suppose Declan would have been taking the view that, you know, we need to take a different approach to this. You know, it's not all about production of meat and milk and that type of thing. So it's looking at the environment and managing the environment, trying to get a production from that.
For me, one of the most important things to get right is the grazing management, and we didn't really know what was happening at the minute. So we set about recording what was actually happening on the hills for the first year. And based on Faith's recommendations, we came up with a plan of actions for farmers to carry out.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks. It's been an absolute honour and a privilege to be part of this project and to have worked with so many people who are in this room, and to have worked with farmers and to have worked in the Wicklow Uplands on a collaborative basis. So I was asked to just share some presentation on what we have in the uplands in Wicklow, what are the habitats, what sort of state are they in, and how do we get them into good condition. So we have a very varied diversity of habitats in the Wicklow Uplands and the Dublin. We can't forget Dublin, the Wicklow and Dublin Uplands. Here's a list of them. For a farmer, this is maybe news. You look at the hill, you look at the mountain, you don't look at habitats. This view looking over the Lugallow Estate and over Loch Tay gives you a sense of some of them. Everything from old oak woodland, we've got cliffs and scree slopes, we've got upland lakes, we've blanket bog, we've wet heath, we've dry heath, we've alpine heath, we've acid grasslands, and these are all in a designated site, which is the Wicklow Mountains SAC, which is an internationally important area for biodiversity. And if we start at the top of the mountains, on our very shallow, thin soils here, we have our alpine, our montane heath. And we've a suite of unique species growing here. Things like crowberry, things like dwarf willow, which have hung on here since the last ice age, growing on little rocks and little spaces up in the uplands. And we also have a lot of good forage for grazing animals, a lot of grass species, and these very interesting club mosses, which are quite scarce and quite unique, and characteristic mosses such as woolly hair moss. So these just give you a sense of some of the plants. So this is montane heath in good condition. Below this then we have our mountain blanket bogs. These are on peats. This is rain-fed peat, things like ling heather, cowberry, crowberry, bilberry, and again mosses and lichens. Here's our crowberry. And the blanket bog is on varying depths of peat, could be 1 to 2 metres, even deeper in places. And we have more species here than we have in our montane blanket bog. Things like purple moorgrass comes in, bog asphodel, cross-leaved heath. And one of the key things here, which is our mosses. Now, I know the farmers say sheep don't eat moss. It's a really important plant. If our bogs are in good condition, they're growing, they're actually sequestering carbon. This gives you an idea of the depth of peat. If peat is growing, it's growing at about 1 millimetre a year. How many thousands of years has that peat taken to form? This is what's underlying the grazing and the habitats of our mountains. Here's a sense of some of the plants: bog cottons, deergrass, purple moorgrass. Once we have things in balance, we have a mixture of all these different species. We don't have one dominating over the other. And we have very specialised plants growing in a very difficult habitat, things that actually trap and kill insects. And who knew we had plants like this, our own Venus flytraps up in the mountains. And underlying all this, we have our sphagnum moss. This is our peat builder. It can hold up to 10 times its own weight in water. There's different types. Some form lawns, some form hummocks, some grow on the edges of ponds. They grow in a range of different colours. A really, really important plant. Also in the uplands, we have natural bog pools. These are brown, acidic areas, again with specialised plants that you don't get growing anywhere else, and our mosses around the edges. On the shallower soils, we have wet heath. We get more things like cross-leaved heath in here, and purple moorgrass, green rib sedge, heath rush, deergrass, and if they're undamaged, we have our mosses and our lichens. Small little plants that are very important. There's our cross-leaved heath and some heath rush. Here's an example of nice wet heath habitat on Glassabulon commonage. And on the shallower, drier soils, on the slopes, and particularly on the eastern side of the mountains, we have our dry heath. And this is a habitat, this is the only habitat for which burning is a management tool. None of the other upland habitats should be burnt. So the typical species we have here, we have our ericoid species, heathers and gorse, and we also have a range of different herbs. And we saw this yesterday when we were on the mountain. It forms a mosaic with acid grassland with a lot of forage for our livestock. So here's our typical dry heath species: ling heather, bell heather, autumn gorse, our frockens. And interspersed in amongst the heath, in balance, we have areas of upland grassland. If we have overgrazing, we have more grassland. It's about getting that balance right. Other areas, we have natural areas of grassland and a lot of forage here for animals, including grasses, but also including a lot of small plants, each of which actually give our sheep something unique, some interesting mineral that we probably don't even understand what they need, but it's giving them grazing. This gives you a sense of upland grazing on Pat's farm on Carcilla, looking down at Kelly's Lake from Lugnaquilla. And here's some of the grass species that we get. The one that we don't want to see a lot of is this one on the bottom left. This is our mat grass. If we're seeing a lot of this coming in on a hill, we know something's out of balance, something is going wrong with the grazing, and we want to see a diverse range of species, and we want to see the flowers that us botanists like as well. Up on the cliffs, up above the lakes, we have a whole unique community of plants which have survived on these cliffs through the Ice Age. Some of these species, the only sites for them in Ireland is a cliff on Wicklow and a cliff in Kerry. That's our alpine lady's mantle. Our club mosses are saxifrages. This gives you a sense of the cliffs up above Loch Uller on Tonlegee in the Glendalough Valley, and also in Lugnaquilla, and some of the plants. A lot of these plants are being lost because they're being grazed out, and they're literally hanging on little rocky outcrops where the animals can't reach. And this gives you a sense of adventures Brian and I had climbing cliffs at the back of Kelly's Loch. At the bottom of these cliffs we have our upland lakes. They're naturally low in nutrients, they're acidic, they're brown because of the peat, and again some interesting plants growing there. Here's Loch Dan. And at the back of these and around the hills we have our Scree slopes. Again, a lot of similar plants, lichens, mosses, ferns, heathy things, scrub. Probably the best valley to see upland Scree is in the Glenmalure Valley, and also around Lugnaquilla, that's around the South Prison. And rising up in our uplands, we have all our upland streams, our upland watercourses. This is where all our rivers start. They're coming over acidic ground, over bedrock. They rise and they fall very quick, and we have a lot of interesting plants around the headwaters. This is like where a little river starts on Carosilla. Here it is, this is the Caraway Stick further down in the valley looking down at it. And we have beautiful waterfalls, of which the Powerscourt waterfall is probably the most famous. Small little pockets of habitat again, little areas of poor fen and flush, a little bit of groundwater coming to the surface here, sedges and rushes, things like marsh violet, marsh cinquefoil, and lots of good areas of mosses. These are examples of poor fen and flush from Ballybeg. And as a component of our uplands that we have very little of, and we're losing sense of what should be up there, is areas of natural areas of oak, birch, holly woodland. These are dominated by those species, also with mountain ash and Scots pine. And the species we're forgetting about are things like aspen and whitebeam and yew. And we see these in our uplands hanging onto cliffs where browsing animals can't get to them. You can see them here on the cliffs up above Loch Dan. That's one of the few stands of aspen in the uplands. And we might think, sure, trees won't do well in the uplands. If you go to the Coronation Plantation, you'll see how well oak and Scots pine do in our upland habitats. And these habitats are supporting a whole range of different animals, including our mountain hares. Obviously, we have a lot of deer, things like lizards. You think, what's a lizard doing up on a mountain? That's where it lives. And our birds. So most of the birds of our uplands are ground nesting. Things like meadow pipits and skylarks. The Wicklow Mountains is a stronghold for red grouse. But we've actually lost quite a number of upland birds in the last 30 years from the Wicklow uplands, and we wouldn't even realise this. We no longer hear the cry of the curlew in the uplands. We've no breeding hen harrier in Wicklow anymore. Ring ouzel are pretty much gone. Golden plover aren't breeding in the uplands anymore. So we're starting to lose stuff without even realising these things are disappearing. We still luckily have species like peregrine falcons and ravens. These nest on cliffs, so they're not necessarily so impacted by a wildfire. All the other ground nesting birds are. Things like snipe, which use wet areas. And it's for this reason that the Wicklow Mountains are designated as a special protection area for the peregrine falcon and the merlin. And supporting all this bird life is a diversity of insects, including stunning species like our emperor moth. So starting out on SUAS, we had huge commonages to look at, and the basic information that was there was from the 2000s, the commonage framework plans. These looked at the hills in a very broad way. There was a lot of schlepping around hills, slogging around, identifying the different habitats. And this just shows how diverse each commonage is. So one prescription does not fit a whole hill. We have a whole range of different habitat types here, all which require different management, different actions. And the ones that are of international importance are what are called the Annex 1 habitats, and they were mapped separately. And in looking at the uplands, we completed what's called habitat condition assessment. And this is using a standardised method that's used across the entire country. And under this, you carry out what's called a number of monitoring stops, and you go through a series of pass-fail objectives. What are we getting? Does this give a sense of, is something overgrazed, undergrazed? What's going on? And this is done at a European-wide level. So every 6 years, the Irish state reports to the European Commission on the state of these habitats. They're listed as either being favourable, unfavourable inadequate, or unfavourable bad. So favourable is green, unfavourable inadequate is orange, and unfavourable bad is red. And this is the state of our upland habitats for essentially the last 20 years. There's very little green there. There's been no improvements in our upland habitats in all that time. So what's going wrong on the hills? Let's look at some of the commonages. A lot of red here on Granamore. Red up on the ridges in Carrageen Duff. Inadequate, unfavourable on the rest of most of the site. Glassavullen, an awful lot of red. Why have we got all this red in the uplands? What's damaging our uplands, and what can we do about it? The number one thing that has damaged upland habitats in Wicklow has been wildfires and illegal burning. We stood and we looked across at this hill yesterday. This is looking at Mawlin. You can see the burns on the hill, and you can see where the bracken is following the burns. And the bracken is a big problem for farmers. There was a lot of burning done where there was a match lit. It burnt as far as a watercourse, and then it stopped. This is an example from Knocknaclahogue up at Lugalaw. Burnt as far as the river and not beyond. And without the data of how frequent these burns are, we forget it and we kind of go, oh yeah, when was that burn? Oh yeah, I think that was 4 years ago. Oh no, and then when you look at the data that's been gathered by the Wildlife Service, these are the burn histories, you can see how regularly and repeatedly sites have been burnt. And this is what we're getting as a result. We're getting damaged peatland habitats that are hemorrhaging carbon and that have no grazing for our livestock. A farmer might have looked up at that after a burn and think, oh sure, that's great, there's loads of green coming on there, there's loads of forage for my sheep. We have bare peat, we have heather starting to come back. The picture on the right there is an area that was burnt twice in the last 20 years. We still have bare peat. We're actually losing our peat to erosion. The peat is running off the mountains and we're hemorrhaging carbon, and we have no grazing here. This is a recent burn earlier this year, which came into the Glassavullen commonage. This shows, that was just earlier in August we were up there. You can see the cracks in the peat. You can see how bad it's starting to get. And yes, you could look at that and you could say, oh, there's sheep up there, there's forage for sheep, there's heather. This is Granamore, this is the ridge on Granamore, this is why it's red. This ridge has suffered really badly and is eroding. Not only is it eroding, we have all this nitrogen deposition. You can see all that green glug in the peat. The water is running off the hill here. And coupled with this, we have a risk of landslides. The Geological Survey of Ireland have mapped the landslides in Wicklow. You can see all the landslides there mapped on Granamore, and they've mapped what's called the landslide susceptibility. So there's a lot of red there, there's a lot of peat at risk of sliding. So this is something we wouldn't think about. This is what's coming out of burning activity, that we might actually lose our mountains. But we're also losing our grazing. We look, we see green coming on the hill, we think that's great. When you actually start looking, what we're getting dominating the grazing are things like heath thrush, deer grass and mat grass. These are all unpalatable to sheep. We're lucky in Wicklow in that we don't have huge swathes of purple moorgrass coming in after burns. That's what's happening to the blanket bogs on the west of Ireland where the burning is taking place. That's all that's left because everything else is getting burnt out of it and we're losing our grazing as well as damaging our habitats. So this burning, it's damaging the peats, it's damaging our grazing, it's facilitating the spread of bracken, which is something that no farmer wants. It's damaging habitats of international importance. It's impacting on our fauna and our invertebrates, our bird life, massive carbon emissions. They reckon that the carbon released from the fire which took place in Killarney National Park was the same from that one fire event, was the same as the emissions from 13,000 vehicles on the road in Ireland in 1 year. Every time our peatlands get burnt, they get harder and drier and they're not functioning, they're not able to sequester carbon. We have a global biodiversity and climate change crisis. We have the solution to that here in our uplands. We're also looking at huge flooding intensity, increased flood risk downstream. That little sphagnum moss that I bang on about and the sheep don't eat, that holds 10 times its own weight in water. It holds onto that water and it releases it slowly. We can spend a fortune downstream on flood defence works in Bray on the Dargle or in Arklow. We need to be dealing with the flood risk up here in the mountains. And we're also looking at the water quality which we all rely on to drink. The Vartry Reservoir and the Poulafuka Reservoir are the main drinking water supplies for over, 1.5 million people. So it gets pretty bad when you go up onto the ridges. This is up on Mullacleavon, on Barnacullion. There's some natural erosion is taking place, but a lot of this is driven, again, from a burn that people lost even a memory of. A burn that got into the peat in the summer and burnt for years, for months and months and months, until eventually it went out. And it's a really serious problem. So what can we do about areas like this? This is, you know, we've actually lost the soil in this area. We're right down to the mineral soil, right down to the rock. We've no grazing here. So this is something that we only got going on SUAS this year, peat stabilisation trials with great collaboration with National Parks and Wildlife Service. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will see there's a fence has been erected around these peat hags to exclude grazers. We picked areas where we had vegetation and we've trialled a few different things, including heatherbrash, very much learning from the Moors for the Future project over in the UK. And even after only, when did the brash get spread up there? I don't know, it was February. This was in September, and you can see the mosses are starting to take hold and starting to stabilise that peat. We also trialled using a grassland mix, and that's working well so far, but even just excluding the grazers, we're getting sheep sorrel coming back, which the sheep love to eat. That was all getting browsed out. So that shows the grazing pressure that's happening in some of these areas. The other thing trying to do is restore hydrology. We're trying to get from cracked eroding peat, like you can see in the upper image, to water that's being held by sphagnum and rising in the ground. So these are problems that are bigger than what farmers can address. These are problems we need a bigger project for. Maybe a LIFE project, or maybe another EIP. This is some work that's been trialled. This is on Granamore, looking at gully blocking with leaky dams. Again, just trying to slow the flow of water off the hill, get this ground up here re-wetted and starting to sequester carbon. It can be done with timber, or it can be done very simply. This is over on Carrigain Duff, just with sods of peat dug out and blocked. And you can see the image on the right. Already we're getting the water being held on the left-hand side of my stick there, and the sphagnum's starting to come. So it's subtle, but every little bit helps, and it's small little steps. But for most farmers, they're completely unaware of what's happening up on the ridge. They normally don't go up there. The sheep go up there and that's it. This is more of concern for farmers, is the tall leggy heather. This is areas that have been previously burnt, so they all started off at one height. They all grew up uniformly to now areas that myself and poor Amber were struggling to get through, over 1 metre high, and dominated by one species. So when we're trying to manage dry heath, what should we be trying to get? We want to have a moss layer below the heath. We want to keep our seed source. We want to have some plants nearby. We want to make sure we've no erosion. So you can see an area that was burnt up on the top and an area that's starting to recover where a burn wasn't too severe. We're getting good recovery there. Again, this is an area that the farmers thought, you can see it was burnt in September 2020. A lot of vegetation left. A farmer thought, oh, that's not a very tidy job. We're thinking of these areas like a field of thistles. We left a load of thistles over there, we better top them, get them out of it. So we want to, if we are going to do a controlled burn, and these were with fire breaks in place, and we need to manage these areas and get animals moving around the hill, we need to burn them lightly and we get a much better recovery. Whereas this was an area that was burnt to within 1 inch of its life, very, very intense, nothing left, and here we are, you know, 2 years on and we still have no recovery, we've no mosses, we've the peat eroding and running off the hill. So people have this idea, well, what if we don't burn the heather, it just grows and grows and grows and gets out of control? Well, dry heath actually has its own natural cycle, and in managing it through either cutting or grazing or burning, we're just trying to speed up that cycle and produce forage for our animals. Here's mature heath naturally starting to fall back, decay, the bilberries coming in, we still have all the mosses. So this idea that we have to do something about these areas, they will go through their own cycle. We're just trying to manage them and make sure we get grazing, make sure the department doesn't penalise us for having ineligible land. But intense burning is not the way to go. Very, very slow to recover. Intense burning leads to peat loss, carbon emissions, we're damaging water quality, and we have biodiversity impacts. This just gives you a sense of 3 different areas. This is over on Powerscourt Paddock. You can see an area that was flailed in 2020, an unburnt area in the background which is naturally going through that cycle that I talked about, and then an area where it had been burnt and there wasn't follow-up grazing, and now we have back to tall leggy heather. So we're ending up in this vicious cycle of areas getting out of control, areas getting burnt to within 1 inch of their life, and we need to break that cycle. And everybody has driven this mantra of burning is the way to do it. It's very interesting just actually doing these things and looking at what happens. So here's an area where you can see that the fire break was put in and the area was burnt. We've actually got better recovery in the flailed area than in the area that was burnt. And we've learned from looking at the height of the heather and trying to work out, should it be double cut, should we cut in different directions, you know, because some of the cutting that was done, and we looked at it on Powerscourt Paddock yesterday, was very tall leggy heather. It was left lie and nothing came back until literally the last year it started to recover. So everything is a learning experience, and you have to get out and you have to trial things, you have to build capacity, you have to build contractors and equipment and expertise, and we're only just starting to have a sense of how this is turning out. This was an area that was flailed on Ballybeg. It never actually got burnt, and you can see it's recovered very nicely. You can see that the cut area there. This is the area that I was talking about on Powerscourt Paddock. You can see the top picture there on the right, looking at how it was lying, and that was in 2018, 2 years after it had been cut, still no recovery. It's starting to recover now, but that's taken a long time. So we've learned from that, if we are going to cut, how do we cut? How do we achieve what we want? So we don't have to have big machines. Lots of places are inaccessible. We want to open up areas, get animals moving around the hill. You can see a series of little squares here These were manually cut on Carrigain Duff down near the forestry, below Bracket Rocks, and even within a year we're getting recovery of vegetation in these areas. So we don't have to go and burn this area. We have other ways of controlling the heather and getting animals moving around the hill. So that's undergrazing, which is what you heard from the farmers about. The hills were getting out of control. What do? We also have some overgrazing. And where we have overgrazing, we also have a problem. It can be that everything is nibbled down. We can have animals then starting to hang out in particular areas on the hill. How do we get animals moving around the hill? Get them out of just overgrazing one area. If we're starting to get our mat grass coming in, you can see we're in trouble here. If something is nibbled down so much, none of this grass on the lower image there can actually even flower and set seed, so we've no seed source for the grasses to rejuvenate. So we have overgrazing and we have undergrazing and we have trampling. So these are all challenges and there's no simple answer to any of it. The hills have been going wrong for a long time. It's going to take a long time to get them right. And it's lots of slow, incremental bits of work, not big areas, small bits, getting different areas done. Here we're starting to lose the heath. You can see how overgrazed it is on the left. It was also burnt. And we get a lot of animals dunging and sitting in an area. So it's been a real learning experience for everybody. It's been maybe the first time, I know it was said, the first time maybe that a farmer and an ecologist walked a hill together, explained why the hill was designated, explained what was so special about it, so unique. These are the jewels of nature conservation areas, not just in Ireland, in a European context. And we are the custodians of them. And we have to listen to each other and we have to learn from each other. And it has been so interesting spending time together on a hill. We didn't have enough of that time because of COVID. We had 2 years where we couldn't walk and talk. But it's invaluable, that time spent. There's huge variation on one commonage. You can't just think, that's the commonage, one size fits all, this is what we do. We've got different habitats. We've got different habitats in different habitat conditions. We have some areas that might be in good conditions, some areas that aren't. How do we work towards moving our habitats into good condition? We're not going to suddenly snap our fingers and everything turns rosy. It's a process. It's about getting the underlying ecological conditions right and getting the habitats going in the right way and getting the grazing going in the right way, getting the farming going in the right way, that farmers continue to have a livelihood in our uplands. Nobody's talking about abandoning hills, rewilding them. Like, these are managed landscapes and it's up to us to manage them properly. And we're dealing with a legacy of past land use which hasn't delivered. If it had, we would have seen an improvement in 20 years of monitoring, which we haven't seen. The liaison with National Parks and Wildlife Service has been critical because there are processes, legal processes that have to take place that are challenging, that farmers, they can't be expected to know how to apply for an activity requiring consent of the minister. That's where somebody like the SUAS Project and Declan and the support of the Wicklow Uplands Council, helping with that paperwork, helping build relationships, working directly with rangers on the hill, side by side. We need more of that, not less. And my take-home message really is that the legacy of the historic burning in the uplands in Wicklow and Dublin has been extremely damaging. And we have a chance now to change that, and it's down to a different mindset. What are we managing the hills for, and how do we get them into good condition? So thank you very much.